In today's episode, I'm going to be discussing once again the topics of spaced learning and retrieval practice when it comes to learning. Given that only recently I've moved to Calgary, Alberta in Canada from the United Kingdom, and I've already noticed in the last month that the education system here is set up in a way which doesn't really allow for this spaced learning. And I believe that from what I'm seeing, it is having an impact here. Therefore, only reinforcing the idea that spaced learning and retrieval practice is paramount to doing well with your learning. So I'll break it down now. So I thought I'd first start with a quick recap of what is spaced learning and what is retrieval practice, for those of you who haven't watched my first video, which I'll link above here. So in a nutshell, essentially, there is this well-known curve called the forgetting curve, which I'll show here, which shows you that when you learn something for the first time, if you basically don't look at it for some period afterwards, could be a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, you begin to forget it, okay? And after, let's say, 4, 5, 6 months of not looking at it, the chances are you know next to nothing of what you learned. But if you then once again look over that material and then read it again, then this time you will still forget it afterwards, but at a slower rate. And by keep doing this over and over again, hopefully by the end of it, you'll almost forget nothing after reading over that material. So this here shows you that rather than cramming in your content for anything, it could be learning for a test as a child at school, or even as an adult learning a language. That's not the best way of doing it. What's best is you to do it a bit in one moment, give it some time, do it again, and keep repeating that. So that is spaced learning. And then what does retrieval practice mean? Well, that essentially is the idea that when you're coming to kind of test yourself, you want to do it essentially under kind of exam conditions and not looking at your notes. The mere process of you trying to force your brain to remember, to recall this information is paramount to learning and remembering this stuff long term. So it's very key that you space it out for spaced learning and then do tests under kind of time conditions and exam conditions here. So you're trying to retrieve that knowledge. That is key. Okay, so let's go back to exactly why I'm making this video after me being here in Canada. So I arrived here, and given my experience in teaching at Eton College and other schools in the UK, I decided that I'd make my own website, the oxfordetontutor.com, for online tutoring and in-person tutoring here in Calgary. So of course, what I did next was I looked up the syllabus, the curriculum, to see exactly, what they learn here. And it became very apparent after speaking to people here, both students and parents, about the system they have in place. And what I found out was that unlike the United Kingdom and European countries and many other countries like Japan and South Korea, where those countries, the subjects such as maths, which I do, which you do it all year round, okay, they don't do that in Canada. In Canada, for many of the years, especially the older years, let's say when you're 17, 18, they have 2 terms, 2 semesters, and they'll do, let's say, maths in one term, and for the second term, well, that's it. There is none, okay? So what's happening here is, for the children's school years, for half of it, they are doing a subject, and for the remaining half, they don't do it at all. So the issue here with this Canadian system, at least in Alberta, is, as you can tell with the spaced learning, well, it's not possible. You only have the 6 months, and you're definitely taking off 6 months of not doing any math or any other subject which you're taking off 6 months for. And in case you're thinking, well, what about the forgetting curve? You just do many quick little cycles in 6 months to become an expert. That isn't the case, and I'll touch on later why that definitely isn't the case here in the Canadian system. And what happens here is, it's a lot harder for these students to ultimately become very proficient in any of these subjects, because you can't keep taking 6 months off of something and not studying it. It's not the optimal way. So all that happens here is that most of these students, they can't make much quick progress because they keep having to go back 2 steps just to go forward. So that's a concern. And just think about it, the whole forgetting curve doesn't just apply to, let's say, academics in school. It applies to all things. Imagine right now you're playing a sport, let's say tennis, and I told you what sounds better, to do regular sessions once a week or twice a week for a whole year, or you to go, right, 3, 4, 5, 6 months of intensive play and then nothing for half a year. I'm hoping you'll notice that the second scenario is not the most efficient, okay? And this is especially apparent, let's say, for me when I was teaching in private schools. What will normally happen is that most of the kids who say were quite sporty, but not the best, what you'll find is that because of the, let's say, the UK schooling system in private schools, where you do, let's say in the first term, you do football, and then second term you do rugby, and then third time you might do tennis or cricket. What that happens is, most of these students who aren't, say, elite athletes, well, they are just doing football for 3 months and not again for 9 months. And guess what? They never become that good. Whereas the best students, surprise, surprise, what do? They, in their spare time in the other, so off-season terms, they'll be going to independent clubs to keep practicing. Or potentially what will happen is the schools will have, in those other terms, for the top teams, some football sessions to keep them going, because they are aware that to be the best, you've got to do things consistently. That is the key here for anything. Think about diets, think about anything. Consistency is key. Okay, so let's now scrutinize this Canadian system a bit more. So looking again at the spaced learning, the whole point is that in theory, to maximize your learning, you want to give the space in between learning a bit of breathing room. You want to give it, say, 4 or 5 days, a week before you want to again touch on it, maybe even more. Because if you simply do it just too quickly, the brain hasn't had time to kind of cement that knowledge, the leg kind of half forgets, relearn it. It needs some time. So in the UK, how the education system works is that you have 2 main years of exams, okay? And these exams are sat by the entirety of the students in the UK. Again, depending on which board they take, but let's say, imagine there's one for now to make it easier. And that will be in their year 11 when they're roughly 16 years old, and then in their year 13 when they're roughly 18. And what's good about this system is that as a teacher, and also say for the students, let's say between your year 11 and year 13, you've got 2 years. Well, because there's no imperative need to learn something immediately because there's no exam, for 2 years, what happens here is you can set up the routine. So me personally, when I'm teaching maths, I have a system where every 2 weeks, I'll have mini tests where those tests start to incorporate just one question of every single topic we've ever done. So by doing that, these students here, by the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th mini test, they've done the first topic 8 times. The second topic, they 7 times. And by the end, before their exams, they're going, I've done that question 1,000,000 times. I haven't forgotten it because I'm keep doing this every single 2 weeks. And this actually makes them a lot less stressed out before the exams, because when they get there, they're thinking, well, I already know 80% of my work. It's just the last little fine tuning, the last details. As opposed to someone going, well, I did that in detail 2 years ago, haven't touched it since, I've forgotten all of it because of the forgetting curve, and now you've got a month before your exam to learn everything. That's very stressful, okay? So let's compare this UK system to the Canadian system in Alberta, and let's see what you think is a better model. So essentially what happens in the Albertan system in Canada is that they'll be setting, let's say, every single week, your teacher will set you a mini test, okay? But this mini test counts towards your final grade, let's say in your equivalent of A-level in year 13, your final diploma it's called, okay? And then let's say you have a few topics. You have topic, mini test, and I think at the end it's a unit test. And all of these little tests count towards your final exam. It might be 1%, 2%, 1%, 4%, okay? And at the very, very end, when you get to your final exam when you're 18, let's say your diploma, which will be the equivalent of the A-level because the entirety of the people in Alberta will take the same exam, but this only counts for about 30% of your grade. So what does this mean? What this means is that your little mini tests in your schools are paramount. They're very important because they count for 70% of your final grade. But why does this system not help spaced learning? Why is it not actually helping the students? Because if you look at their structure for that week, and I've seen it firsthand, it will be, for example, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, it will be an hour and a half of maths for a brand new topic. And on that Friday, bam, test. Test for that 4 days work. And that's a bit ludicrous, because imagine right now in this scenario, what if you don't get the material? You haven't had time to actually properly go through it and understand it, which, by the way, for that forgetting curve, you're assuming that the height of that line is your knowledge. If you read it and didn't get it, then that curve is 0. You've learned nothing, okay? So that's one thing here. But then let's say that after that test, you want to then go through it in your spare time and have that spaced learning. Well, all that happens is you've got the next week work with the next week important little mini test. So therefore, you can never really catch up because you've got the next important bit. And then finally, when you have that unit test, which does, go back through all those mini tests, you wouldn't have time to do the spaced learning and those retrieval tests because you've got bam, 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 tests back to back. And after that, they'll go bam, bam, finito, you've done your math for those 6 months, now go away. This for learning, as hopefully you can see, is not efficient because what happens here is, either you didn't get material, you did not great, and that's it, and then in 6 months' time, you know even less than that, 0. Or you have the scenario that is kind of sad, which is that you have an individual, a student, who is actually very good at learning things quickly, so they've learnt the stuff, because it's still ideally fresh in their mind from that curve, they get a good grade in their test. But then because they don't need it kind of ever again, or at least for a long time, then on that graph, it goes to 0. So basically you're learning something, just kind of cram short term just for your exam. And then if that's the case, on a bigger note here, what's the point of going to school and doing stuff if you learn it and then in a year's time have no knowledge whatsoever of that material? That's pretty pointless. So I hope you're seeing here, it's not a big bash to this system, but more a positive to why if you can do spaced learning, that's how it should be done. And it's just quite surprising here that the education boards in Canada do have it in this particular setup. Maybe in the future they will change. Because what I can say is when comparing at least the math syllabus for the UK and Canada, or at least Alberta, they are definitely, I would say, about a year and a half, if not 2 years behind, as in the UK is 2 years ahead of them in terms of content. And look, I'm sure it's not just the Albertan curriculum that is like this. I'm sure there are many other countries too that do similar things. So if you are students who want to use this spaced learning, then the best thing you can do is, if you're in one of these countries that have these 6 months off, well, in those 6 months, don't just fully give up on that subject. Do keep doing once a week, or perhaps once every 2 weeks, some math, for example, just to keep it ticking. And there are boundless resources online that can help you do this. And if you want to go one step further, rather than just keeping up to date with what you learned last year, try and get ahead. That's really how in this current system you will thrive. If you can go look online, find the material for next year, read the content, go on YouTube, go on websites, and then get ahead. And guess what? When you're doing those, Monday to Thursday, test on Friday scenarios, you're not rushing because you already know it. Those lessons will be your spaced learning and your retrieval practice, okay? So that's what I recommend. And guess what? If you yourself find it hard to learn by yourself online, well, you can use the oxfordetontutor.com and I can help you out. Because what I do with my students is I make sure that they are getting ahead of the game so that when they have to have their mini tests and unit tests, well, guess what? They've been doing it 20 times over for the last half a year. But look, for the record, and just to finish on this example with the Canadian education system where spaced learning isn't implemented, I'll mention one thing, which is that I'm not saying that regular testing, like official testing for your final diploma or A-level, I don't think it's bad to have regular testing every, let's say, 2 or 3 weeks. That's fine, because actually in some ways, it takes off the pressure of having, let's say, in the UK, that 1 week or 1 month of exams where it all counts. And if you mess it up, then tough. That can be quite stressful. And also with the system of regular testing, it gives credits to those students who've been working hard all year round. As opposed to what can happen in the UK is that students cram in last minute, and then you get all the negatives that I was discussing for the Canadian system, which is that students learn it all short-term memory, do okay in the exam, and then a month later have forgotten it, but guess what? They got their grade. That's not good. And also bear in mind that very few teachers currently actually use what I do, the spaced learning and retrieval tests, which means that many of these students have no idea for 11 months of the year and just do cramming. That's not good. But The key word I mentioned there was all year around, which means that you have to have lessons and tests all year round, which isn't the case with the Canadian's current system. I mean, what could work actually best would be to have, rather than 4 sessions and a test right there, well, spread it out over the whole year and have 2 lessons a week, and then every fortnight is your test, which means that even though you have the same amount of content to get through, at least you have that weekend in between to revise half of that topic, which takes pressure off you, lets you have that space learning. Or if you're bound by those rules of 6 months on and 6 months off, then what you could do instead is to have your 4 lessons, okay? And then rather than having that test right there, you have that test a week later after the next topic. That's fine. The test can be always 1 topic delayed. At least it gives you time again to be doing regular revision. Ideally, you'd have a lot more time per subject, but they'll be constrained by their timetable, which would mean that to give more time would mean to reduce the number of subjects. And look, in the UK for your, let's say, your A-level when you're 18 or so, normally you take 3 or 4 subjects. I think in Canada you take more than that, which is why they have, more crammed in and fewer lesson time. And one final thing, when I mentioned beforehand about how the UK was kind of 2 years ahead, that was more applicable to the further maths course, so the more intense math courses. Because what happens here is, even though yes, I am right in saying that they are 2 years ahead in terms of age, what happens here is, because in the UK, you can technically stop maths age 16, and they try and get everything done at age 16, whereas in Canada, it's 18. So what happens here is that by the end of the Canadian 18-year-olds course, they've done most of what the UK kids have done at age 16. So at 16 years old, the UK students know a lot more, but then they might drop it and the other Canadian students, by the time they're 18, would have learnt it too. But here's the difference. In the UK, you can take maths, let's say, to A-level if you want to use that in your degree. And that course there is equivalent to the, I think it's called 31 in Canada, the intense maths course. But in the UK, if you want to really be great at maths and go to the top unis, you can take further maths. And what I'm seeing here is that, that option isn't in Canada. Their hardest maths course is almost equivalent to the middly A-level maths, not further maths. So that's where, if you are like on the top student for maths, from what I'm seeing currently, the UK model has it better. Anyway, hopefully you can see here a scenario where spaced learning isn't so easy to implement and the pros and cons of that. And hopefully you can find time in your schedule to, whatever you're learning, to implement these things. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button and bell notification. Feel free to leave any comments and any suggestions for future content. And as ever, onwards and upwards.